At a glittering political gala, Ethan, a smug, conservative pianist, publicly humiliated Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in front of Washington's elite. She sat at the piano like stepping into a firing squad, her hands trembling, the first note off. The room burst into laughter. But seconds later, her music cut through the air like a blade, and every smirk froze in place. What happened next that turned a public humiliation into a moment no one in that room would ever forget? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Willard Intercontinental gleamed with power that night. Marble floors, golden chandeliers, and whispers laced with ambition. It wasn't just a gala, it was a coliseum for the elite, where every glance was a calculation and every smile a strategy. Jasmine Crockett walked in like a spark dropped in dry timber. Young, bold, unapologetically blue in a blood-red room. Cameras snapped, conversations dipped. She wasn't welcome, and she knew it. Across the room, Ethan Drake straightened from the piano like a man about to enjoy a hunt. Acclaimed concert pianist, darling of the conservative donor circuit and master of public humiliation, he saw Jasmine not as a guest, but as bait. He touched the keys, letting out a few teasing notes, then turned toward her with a grin already sharpened for attack. And then, just as Jasmine's heels met the marble, came the voice. Smooth, theatrical, and aimed like a sniper shot. "Well, well," Ethan Drake called out, rising from the piano like a showman taking center stage. "Congresswoman Crockett has joined us." I was beginning to wonder if progressive Twitter had a curfew. The words sliced through the air. Heads turned. Laughter flickered in small bursts like warning shots. Ethan didn't wait. He was circling now, not with his feet but with his words, his voice commanding attention, like a baton at a concert. "Tell me, Jasmine," he said, gesturing mockingly toward the piano beside him, "do you actually know how to play one of these? Or is your talent limited to banging out hashtags in defense of Biden's latest blunder?" The crowd began to shift. Elbows nudged, drinks paused midair. Some smiled behind their glasses. Others reached for their phones, sensing the blood in the water. Jasmine stood frozen, not from fear, but because she understood. This wasn't casual banter. It was a calculated strike. Ethan wasn't done, not even close. "Come on," he said, tapping a single key, letting its lonely note echo across the ballroom. "You march for justice. You speak for the voiceless. Surely you can handle a little piano, no?" His smile was razor thin, mocking, without raising his voice. "Unless, of course," he added, tone dropping to a patronizing purr, "the only keys you're comfortable with are the ones on your iPhone." The crowd chuckled, not because it was funny, but because they wanted it to be true. "Show us something real," Ethan said, eyes locked on Jasmine. "Unless your kind of performance ends when there's no trending topic to stand on." Phones were now raised openly. The ballroom wasn't watching, it was waiting. Not for music, for collapse. Jasmine knew this moment wasn't about melody or politics anymore. It was about humiliation, served cold in public, beneath crystal chandeliers and fake smiles. This was no longer a gala, it was a duel, not with guns or speeches, but with talent. Ethan had turned the piano into a weapon, the stage into a trap. The room leaned in, breath held, hoping for a stumble, a refusal, something to affirm the quiet prejudice they carried beneath their cufflinks and cocktail dresses. And Jasmine, the lone woman of color in a room built to break people like her, stood at the edge of it all, every muscle taut with the weight of two worlds. She could walk away, let the insult hang, spare herself the risk of failure. Or she could step forward, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in rooms like this. Ethan smiled again, smug and certain. "Don't worry," he said, chuckling softly. "We won't judge you. Much. Unless you try to play, then we'll just enjoy the show." A few in the crowd laughed again, not because they thought she would fail, but because they didn't believe she'd even dare. The crowd still waited, motionless, expectant. But inside Jasmine, the silence cracked open something older than fear, a memory, a room, a rhythm. And suddenly the ballroom wasn't marble and gold anymore. It was linoleum and faded curtains, the scent of cornbread in the air, and a battered upright piano sitting against the peeling wall of her grandmother's apartment in South Dallas. She was 8, barefoot, elbows too high. Her grandmother, a retired music teacher with arthritic fingers and a voice that could hush chaos, stood beside her, patient but firm. "Don't press the keys," her grandmother had said, tapping Jasmine's wrist with a pencil. "Coax them." Jasmine remembered the first time she played something that wasn't just notes, but feeling, a gospel tune, clumsy but alive, and how her grandmother looked at her afterward, not like a child, but like a vessel. "Baby," she'd whispered, "you can be anything in this world, but don't you ever let them take this. This music, it's your truest voice." That promise had lived in her, once, but life, as always, came with teeth. By high school, Jasmine learned that talent wasn't armor. Piano didn't help you survive in neighborhoods patrolled like war zones. It didn't silence teachers who thought brilliance didn't belong in a black girl's mouth. It didn't stop counselors from steering her away from music scholarships toward practical careers. So she put it away, not with bitterness, but with resignation. Law school wanted precision, not melody. Capitol Hill demanded sharp elbows, not soft hands. The piano became something she used to do, like hopscotch or poetry. A luxury, like softness, that she believed she no longer had the right to. By the time she won her first election, music was a ghost she didn't speak to anymore. She wore power like armor, spoke in sound bites, struck back in hearings and headlines. People praised her fire, her clarity, her bite. But no one ever asked if she missed harmony. No one ever wondered what it cost to become the strong one. Because in politics, especially as a black woman, you're not allowed to falter, to feel, to create. You're expected to win, or to vanish. And so she smiled through interviews, sharpened her voice, learned to stand taller than the rooms that tried to shrink her. But beneath every podium, every TV light, something stayed buried. A sound, a memory, a promise. And now, staring at Ethan Drake, at his sneering challenge and the silent army of watchers behind him, that memory surged like a heartbeat beneath her ribs. Her grandmother's voice echoed again. "Don't you ever let them take this." Jasmine wasn't sure if her fingers still remembered, but her soul did, and that might be enough. The memory of her grandmother's voice was still echoing, still warm, still fighting for air. But reality crashed in like a cold fist. Malik appeared beside her, moving fast, his expression tight, jaw clenched. His voice was low, urgent, almost panicked. Not the calm strategist who'd handled press ambushes and political fires, but a man watching his friend walk into a kill zone. "Jazz," he breathed, his eyes darting to the raised phones and blinking red recording lights. "Don't, not like this. If you slip, if you freeze, Fox is going to run that footage like it's Super Bowl halftime. All week, all day. They're hungry for it." She didn't answer. Her gaze was locked on Ethan Drake, still lounging near the Steinway, still soaking in the spotlight like it was his birthright. Malik stepped closer, dropped his voice to a near growl. "This whole thing's a goddamn setup. You know it. They're not looking for music. They're looking for failure. You miss one note, and you're not just a punchline. You're a warning to every black girl who thought she could walk into a room like this and belong." Jasmine's hands twitched, but not from fear, from the pressure building in her chest like a war drum. "They'll clip your face, not the keys. They'll loop your stutter, your pause, your breath, and they'll say, 'See? That's what you get when you elevate outrage over excellence.'" Her breath caught, not from doubt, but rage. Slow, quiet, burning, hot rage. She turned her head just enough to look Malik in the eye. "You think I don't know that?" she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "You think I don't feel every damn camera on my skin right now?" He didn't respond, didn't have to. She inhaled, long and sharp, then added softer this time. "I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing this because I remember who I am." She looked back toward the piano, her pulse pounding like footsteps before a fight. And I'll be damned if I let that smug bastard be the one who erases it. Malik's shoulders dropped, just slightly. He didn't agree, but he understood. He knew better than to stop her now, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just walking toward a piano. She was walking straight into the fire, and this time, she meant to burn. Under the blistering weight of every eye in the room, Jasmine didn't flinch. She turned toward Ethan, slowly, deliberately, and met his stare with the force of a woman who'd had enough of being measured, enough of being underestimated, enough of being framed before she'd even spoken. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes didn't blink. Then, with the same calm as a fuse, moments before detonation, she said, "I'll play." The room stilled. Even the ice in glasses seemed to stop cracking. And then, one step. She moved forward. Ethan's smirk didn't budge, but something behind his eyes flickered. "Wow," he muttered, half to her, half to the room, loud enough for microphones to catch. The Congresswoman herself. What a privilege. Let's all watch a rising star. Try not to fall flat. He gestured grandly to the piano like a magician revealing the trapdoor. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, dripping sarcasm, "a musical debut or a political career in freefall. We'll find out in 3 minutes or less." Chairs creaked as guests leaned in. A low ripple of muffled laughter passed through the back of the ballroom, the kind that tastes like blood. One donor chuckled. "She's really doing it." Another whispered, "She's got guts." Or no idea what's coming. Phones were up, locked in. One camera was live streaming already. Jasmine could see it in her peripheral vision, red light blinking like a silent countdown to humiliation. No one expected a triumph. No one expected anything but collapse. That was the plan. That was always the plan, and Jasmine knew it. She felt it pressing against her ribs like the flat edge of a blade. But she didn't stop. She didn't speak again. She just walked, straight toward the piano. And every breath in the room followed her like prey watching a lioness step into the ring. She reached the bench like a soldier reaching the front line, not in triumph, but in readiness. The sound of her heels against the marble faded behind her, but the noise in the room never left. It was still there, in the raised phones, in the restrained smirks, in the tension that hummed beneath the chandeliers. Jasmine slowly lowered herself onto the Steinway's bench, every motion measured, deliberate, as if the instrument itself might reject her. Her hands hovered above the keys, not touching, not yet, just breathing in the silence that had grown so loud it felt like pressure on her chest. She wasn't just sitting at a piano. She was sitting inside a trap disguised as opportunity, where every wrong note would be a weapon in someone else's hands. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from memory, because this wasn't the first time she'd sat like this, with the weight of the world pressing down on her back. She exhaled slowly, her palms open, and placed her fingers gently onto the keys, as if greeting something sacred that had been locked away for years. The cold surface of the ivory didn't feel foreign. It felt familiar, not like touching a tool, but like laying a hand on the shoulder of an old friend who hadn't spoken in a long time. For a second, she closed her eyes, not to escape, but to listen, to hear the room, to hear her grandmother's voice, to hear the rhythm of her own heartbeat fighting to stay steady. She didn't care who was watching anymore. Not Ethan, not the donors, not the cameras waiting to cut her into a meme. They had their stories ready, of failure, of arrogance, of overreach. But they didn't know the one thing that pulsed through her veins more than politics ever had. She didn't come here to impress. She came to remember. And with her hands on the keys, she was no longer their symbol. She was her own. She didn't rush. She didn't speak. She simply inhaled, once deep, and let her fingers ease into motion. The opening chords of Georgia on My Mind floated from the Steinway, soft as breath, heavy as memory. It wasn't a simple tune, not the sanitized version people played at open mics or hotel lobbies. Jasmine was attempting the Ray Charles arrangement, a slow, aching, gospel-laced blues rendition that demanded more than just technical skill. It required control. It required soul. It required a kind of restraint that few could master. Bending notes just shy of breaking, stretching time without losing tempo. It was a piece that exposed even seasoned musicians because you couldn't hide behind speed or showmanship. You had to bleed through every note. And Jasmine, with shaking hands and 1,000 cameras in her face, was laying herself bare. And then the third note. Wrong. Just enough. It hit slightly ahead of the beat, a millisecond too soon, slicing through the melody like a cracked bell. It wasn't a disaster, but it was audible, real, unforgiving. Her left hand froze for half a second. Her right flinched. The spell snapped. A ripple shot through the ballroom. Ethan leaned in with perfect timing, his voice like a dagger wrapped in silk. "That's bold," he said, loud enough for several tables to hear. Picking a piece that gives real musicians nightmares. Even professionals struggle with that phrasing. He tilted his head with mock concern. But hey, confidence is everything, right? Then, the smile, that smug, practiced, camera-ready half smirk that said he wasn't surprised, only amused. Then he shifted closer to a heavy-set man seated beside him, a fellow donor dressed in a tux just slightly too tight. Ethan leaned in with the practiced ease of someone delivering a punchline. "Told you," he murmured, voice low but clear enough to carry. "She doesn't have it," he snorted quietly, the kind of laugh that's less about humor and more about superiority. That's what happens when you confuse politics with performance. The man grinned and nodded, sipping his scotch with the air of someone watching a losing bet play out just as predicted. A few others nearby chuckled, low and pleased. One woman whispered behind her hand, "What did she think was going to happen?" The crowd responded on cue. A few gasps, a few stifled laughs, 1,000 silent judgments tightening around Jasmine like a vice. She heard it, all of it. The mistake wasn't fatal, but it was enough. Enough for them to taste blood. Enough for them to start writing the obituary of the moment. Not just for the song, but for her. They didn't want her to stop because she failed. They wanted her to stop because it proved they were right, that she never should have tried. The room waited for her to break. Jasmine sat frozen at the keys, her mistake still echoing somewhere in the back of her skull. She could feel the crowd beginning to lean back in their seats. Not out of politeness, but quiet satisfaction. Their assumption had landed. She'd reached too far, flown too high, dared too boldly. And now the fall was beginning. One wrong note, and the story they wanted to tell about her was already writing itself in their minds. Too confident, not skilled enough, out of her league. She felt it in her chest, the familiar weight of not being allowed to fail, not even once. She wasn't just playing a song. She was playing against every room she'd ever been underestimated in. Every boardroom, courtroom, green room. Every time someone had smiled at her resume and said, "Impressive," but with a tone that meant, but still not enough. Her hands trembled above the keys, not from fear, from fury. And then the voice came, quiet, clear, unshakable. "You don't play to impress," her grandmother had said once, when Jasmine was 12, sobbing after forgetting a line in a recital at the community church. "You play to remember who you are." Those words didn't come back as nostalgia. They hit like lightning through the fog. Her grandmother had never needed applause to know her worth. She didn't teach Jasmine to be flawless. She taught her to be truthful. She taught her that music wasn't decoration. It was declaration. A way of saying, "I am here. I exist, and you will hear me." That sentence, that single sentence, pierced through the layers of noise Jasmine had carried for years. The pressure to perform, the need to prove, the armor she wore in every committee hearing, the perfectly measured tone she used in interviews. It all cracked because she finally remembered. The music wasn't about them. It never had been. It wasn't about Ethan Drake's smirk or the pundits waiting for her to fumble. It wasn't about the donors who smiled when she entered, but dismissed her the second she missed a note. It wasn't even about the room. It was about Jasmine, the version of her that existed before politics, before the headlines, before she'd been forced to package her voice into talking points and her passion into policy. Music was the first place she ever felt free. And her grandmother had been the first person to tell her that freedom mattered. You don't play to impress, you play to remember who you are. That wasn't comfort, it was instruction. It was permission to stop surviving and start speaking again. And so she did. She inhaled, slowly, fully, like it was her first real breath in years. Her spine lifted, her hands lowered, and when her fingers touched the keys again, she wasn't performing, she was remembering. And in that act of remembering, she was rewriting everything, one note at a time. And then, the music changed. Georgia on My Mind rose from the piano not as a song, but as a reckoning. It didn't sound like someone performing. It sounded like someone surviving. Jasmine's fingers moved with fierce clarity now, like they were no longer playing notes but stitching her story back together. Piece by piece, memory by memory, breath by breath. The melody stretched and swayed, not for drama, but because that's how truth sounds when it's finally allowed to speak. Her left hand grounded the rhythm with a quiet, pulsing gravity, while her right hand floated over the higher keys like smoke curling from fire. The touch was delicate, yes, but it was never weak. Every phrase had spine. Every rest had purpose. Every slur and slide held the kind of emotion that can't be taught in any conservatory, only earned through living. She leaned into the melody like she was carrying weight in her chest, and the piano was the only place to set it down. She was no longer chasing redemption. She was reclaiming it. The phrasing turned bold. She let chords linger a half-second longer than expected, as if daring the room to interrupt her. But no one did, because something in the room had cracked. Something invisible but undeniable. The sneers had disappeared. The whispering stopped. People were listening now, not out of politeness, but because they couldn't look away. A man near the back, who earlier had whispered, "She's toast," now sat forward in his chair, elbows on knees, mouth slightly open. A woman in a sequined gown, who had smirked at Jasmine's misstep, lowered her glass mid-sip, eyes wet and blinking. And then, one chair slid back. A tall, graying man in the second row, a senator maybe, rose to his feet, slow but certain. He clapped once, softly, almost hesitant, as if he didn't want to break the spell but had to honor it. Someone 2 rows behind him followed, then another. The ripple turned into a wave. Chairs pushed back, palms met. The clapping wasn't thunderous. It was reverent, like an apology from people who didn't have the words to say they'd been wrong. Jasmine didn't look up. Her hands didn't waver. She wasn't playing for applause. She wasn't playing for anyone's forgiveness. She was playing for her grandmother, for the little girl who used to play in the dark while others slept, for the woman who had buried this part of herself just to survive politics, just to be taken seriously. And now she had pulled that part back out, and it refused to be quiet. Each note grew stronger. Her dynamics swelled, the emotion tightening, then releasing like a breath she'd held her whole life. She rolled through the bridge with a controlled intensity that even trained pianists struggle to balance, hitting the syncopations just behind the beat, leaning into the dissonance before resolving it, using silence like punctuation. Her face didn't show effort. It showed memory, determination, peace. For the first time all evening, she wasn't surrounded by critics. She was surrounded by people, listening, watching, learning. And Ethan? He sat frozen, jaw tight, hands clasped in front of him. His smirk was gone. He didn't glance at his friends, didn't whisper another word. He just stared at the woman he'd tried to humiliate, the woman who now owned the room he thought he controlled. His confidence had been built on the idea that she'd falter, that she'd crumble, that she'd run. But she hadn't. She had stayed. She had played. And she had done something he couldn't interrupt. Not with charm, not with sarcasm, not with skill. She had said everything without speaking a single word. And that, more than any wrong note or right one, was what silenced him. The final notes of Georgia on My Mind did not end so much as they dissolved. Slow, weightless, drifting upward into the stillness of the ballroom like smoke from something holy. Jasmine held the last chord just long enough for it to settle deep into the walls, into the bones of every person in the room. Then with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every bar, she lifted her hands from the keys. No flair, no dramatics, just silence. Her palms hovered above the ivory for a heartbeat longer, as if she were holding something delicate between her fingers, and then she let them fall to her lap. It was over. Not just the song, the proving, the battle, and Jasmine didn't move. She sat with her shoulders back, chin slightly lifted, breathing in through her nose like someone who had just come out of deep water. Her chest rose and fell steadily, not triumphant. Free. For the first time all night, she wasn't carrying anyone else's expectations. Not her parties, not the presses, not the rooms, and not her own. She had stepped into their trap, played their piano, stared down their doubt, and made it hers. She had finished not because they believed in her, but because she did. Then the silence cracked, not loudly, but unmistakably. A single clap from somewhere in the middle of the room, measured, respectful, then another, a third, and suddenly the sound caught momentum like fire touching dry brush. The applause spread in waves, chairs scraped back, hands met. Dozens of people, then more, rising to their feet. First slowly, hesitantly, almost unsure of what they were doing, then with conviction. Jasmine had not asked for their approval, but she had earned their respect. Not with charm, not with polish, with truth. Some clapped with reverence, others with guilt, a few with open awe. A woman near the back covered her mouth with one hand, visibly emotional. A man in a navy suit wiped his eye with a napkin and quickly tucked it away, hoping no one saw. But people saw, because in a room that had been designed to expose her, Jasmine had revealed something in them instead. Something they hadn't expected. Something they didn't know how to respond to, except by standing up. Jasmine slowly stood from the bench, her hands at her sides, still not smiling, still not seeking. She wasn't looking for the cameras. She wasn't looking for the praise. She had given the music everything it asked for, and it had answered. That was enough. And then, from off to the right, came the voice. Familiar, small, pathetic now. Ethan Drake didn't stand, didn't clap. His arms were crossed tight against his chest, face pale with the strain of forced detachment. His smirk had cracked hours ago. But now all that remained was a man trying to salvage the smallest piece of control from the ashes of his humiliation. He leaned toward the closest group of donors, voice just loud enough to reach Jasmine's ears and a few others. Not bad, he muttered dryly, for a congresswoman. It was supposed to sound like a jab, but it landed like a whimper. No one laughed. No one echoed him. They weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Jasmine. And not one of them, not even the ones who had chuckled earlier, who had whispered, who had doubted, looked away. Because in that moment, Ethan hadn't just lost a challenge, he had lost the room. And worse, he had revealed himself, petty, small, outplayed not by politics, but by soul, by truth, by a woman who had nothing to prove, but everything to reclaim. And Jasmine? She turned just slightly, catching his eye for half a second, not with a smirk, not with triumph, just calm, complete, unshaken. Then she walked away, not with swagger, not with theatrics, but with the quiet power of someone who knows exactly who she is, and who no longer needs anyone's permission to be it. As the applause faded behind her and the ballroom's velvet doors closed, something else opened. Far beyond Washington, far beyond politics. Within the hour, the clip of Jasmine at the piano, shaky phone video, filmed from the far left corner of the room, was online. It wasn't polished. It didn't need to be. Her face was half in shadow. The audio crackled, but the story it told was unmistakable. A woman who'd been challenged to break and answered with beauty. The video spread not through headlines, but through whispers. Forwarded between friends, shared by strangers, reposted not because of who she was, but because of what she did. She hadn't just played, she had fought, and that struck deeper than politics ever could. Then late that night, a video began circulating. Not from a newsroom, but from a truck cab. A middle-aged man, somewhere in a parking lot in Ohio or Indiana, sat behind the wheel of a rust-colored pickup. His flannel shirt was frayed at the collar, his hands calloused. He stared into his phone for a long second before speaking. "I haven't picked up a guitar in 20 years, he said, voice thick with hesitation. "Used to play jazz with my brother. We do little gigs in dive bars. Nothing big. Then the plant downsized. We lost the house. I sold my gear." He exhaled, slow, almost ashamed. "And I told myself it didn't matter. That music was a phase. That grown men don't get to chase that kind of thing." He paused again. "But I saw her tonight, Jasmine Crockett. I watched her take every ounce of doubt they threw at her and play like it was oxygen." He blinked, his voice cracking just slightly. "It reminded me of who I used to be." Then came the line that spread like fire. "I don't care how long it's been. Tomorrow I'm playing again, even if no one hears it." That one video became a spark. Soon the comments poured in, raw, unfiltered, from corners of the country no spotlight ever touches. A man from Iowa wrote, "Used to be a drummer in high school, played in a church band before deployment, haven't touched a kit since Iraq. But tonight, I sat in the garage and just tapped out a rhythm on a metal chair. First time I felt something real in years." Another from a retired railroad worker in Mississippi. "I've had a violin in my attic since '94. Didn't think anyone cared if I ever played again. But damn, she made me want to feel again." And one from a welder in rural Montana, short and heavy. "She didn't play for applause. She played for herself. That's what hit me. That's what I forgot I used to do too." Thread after thread, post after post, no slogans, no spin. Just men remembering they once made music, once created, once had quiet dreams that didn't make money but made them feel alive. These weren't artists. These were fathers, veterans, shift workers, grandfathers, people who hadn't been seen in years. And somehow, in 3 minutes of trembling keys and swelling chords, Jasmine had held up a mirror they hadn't looked into since youth. She didn't preach to them. She didn't speak to them. She simply played. And through that, she spoke to something they'd forgotten was even there. She didn't just inspire. She reminded them of who they used to be. And for many of them, that was the beginning of who they might still become. The echo of applause had long since faded, but Ethan Drake still heard it, louder now, sharper, as if each clap were a knife twisting deeper into his pride. Hours had passed since the gala ended, but to Ethan, time seemed frozen in that humiliating moment when Jasmine Crockett's fingers defied him, defied the room, defied every smug expectation. He sat hunched over at the dimly lit end of a polished mahogany bar, the shadows obscuring most of his face, reflecting the turmoil he felt within. The bartender glanced over occasionally, sensing something heavy but not daring to disturb him. Ethan's half-empty glass of bourbon remained largely untouched, the amber liquid catching the faint flicker of neon signs bleeding through the bar's tinted windows. The place was almost deserted. Just Ethan, his tangled thoughts, and the bitter silence that felt louder than any symphony he'd ever played. The door creaked open behind him, letting in a brief gust of cool night air and the murmurs of distant traffic. Ethan didn't turn around. Footsteps approached, steady, cautious, and a familiar voice spoke softly, almost hesitantly. "Ethan? You all right, man?" Lucas, Ethan's oldest friend and manager, stood close, leaning gently against the bar, studying Ethan's face with careful eyes. Ethan smiled bitterly, the kind of smile worn by someone who's been punched too hard to pretend it didn't hurt. He exhaled slowly, swirling the whiskey in his glass, watching it move like liquid gold caught in a slow dance. "Am I all right?" Ethan repeated the question, tasting its absurdity. His voice came out thin, edged with a bitterness he usually reserved for his sharpest critiques. "I just got publicly humiliated by a congresswoman who hadn't touched a piano in years, Lucas. How do you think I am?" Lucas sighed, sliding onto the stool next to Ethan, ordering a drink with a quick nod. "Come on, Ethan. It wasn't that bad. She surprised everyone, sure, but it's just one moment. You're still you." Ethan laughed quietly, a hollow sound without humor, turning his gaze finally to meet Lucas's eyes. Am I? Because for the first time in my career, I felt invisible, completely overshadowed. It wasn't just a performance, it was a goddamn statement. She didn't just play, Lucas. She took something from me. She took that room from me. He took out his phone, thumb hovering over the screen, the pale blue light casting stark shadows on his tired face. He opened Twitter, fingers dancing over the keys instinctively, drafting a tweet that would sting, something sharp enough to remind everyone who he was, who she wasn't. The words formed easily, almost comfortingly. Cute performance from Congresswoman Crockett. But let's remember, politics isn't a performance art. Stick to your talking points. His finger hovered over the send button, twitching slightly. But as Ethan reread his words, a wave of self-disgust washed over him. He could almost hear Jasmine's notes again. Clear, raw, authentic. He could hear the sincerity, the defiance. Something deep inside him cracked open, just enough to stop him. With a frustrated sigh, he deleted the draft, thumb tapping rapidly against the screen, erasing each carefully chosen barb. Instead, he typed slowly, deliberately, each letter feeling heavy with reluctant honesty. Finally, he tweeted, "She played well. Her politics are still wrong, but today I have nothing else to say." He dropped his phone onto the bar, feeling strangely empty, yet lighter. Lucas watched him carefully, raising his glass in a quiet salute. Ethan mirrored the gesture, their glasses clinking softly, sounding strangely final. Ethan Drake knew he had lost, not just tonight, but perhaps something deeper, something he didn't yet fully understand. And in that quiet bar, beneath the flickering neon and murmuring darkness, he accepted it, silently, painfully, but undeniably. Meanwhile, as Ethan's last bitter tweet settled into the digital ether, Jasmine drove through the quiet Washington streets toward a modest brick townhouse in a residential pocket of Capitol Hill, headlights carving pale tunnels through the midnight drizzle. Each red stoplight a reminder that the world beyond the gala still moved at an ordinary pulse even after a night that had tried to break her. When she finally stepped inside, the scent of cedar and laundry wrapped around her. And there stood Marcus, her husband still in the rumpled shirt he'd worn to teach AP history that day, waiting at the hallway's end with a proud, almost reverent smile that said he had already seen the viral clip and knew the cost of every note she played. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached out, brushed rain from her shoulders, and guided her past stacked lesson plans and half-graded essays toward the living room, where a weather-scarred spinet piano, bought second-hand the year they married, then largely ignored when campaigns and committee hearings consumed her nights, waited beneath a dusty lamp, its once glossy walnut dulled by time but still holding the promise of sound. The house was silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the soft breathing of their 6-year-old daughter, Amara, asleep upstairs. Yet the moment Jasmine sat on the creaking bench, that silence felt less like emptiness and more like permission, as if the walls themselves understood she needed one more song, not for applause or defiance, but to reclaim the private joy buried under public battles. Her fingers hovered over the chipped keys, and she realized her hands no longer trembled. The memory of chandeliers, cameras, and predatory smiles remained vivid. But here, in the lamplight's gentle circle, those memories became background noise, replaced by the steady warmth of Marcus's presence just behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder in quiet solidarity. She began to play the same Ray Charles arrangement of Georgia on My Mind, yet this rendition drifted slower, softer, each note stretched like a deep breath after running. No need to impress, no need to protect herself, just letting the melody wander through the rooms, up the staircase, and into the spaces where daily stresses hid. Halfway through, Marcus exhaled a shaky sigh, the kind he usually saved for graduation ceremonies when his students surpassed expectations. And Jasmine realized that even in victory she had carried tension home, but now the chords were bleeding it out of her, measure by measure. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Amara, stirred by the distant piano, padded to the banister in her unicorn pajamas, rubbing her eyes and watched as her mother's silhouette swayed gently. Jasmine modulated into the bridge with deliberate tenderness, knowing her daughter was listening, gifting the child a lullaby that carried the weight of an entire night's struggle yet sounded to innocent ears like nothing but love. When the final chord faded, Jasmine rested her palms on the worn wood, the air thick with resonance, and only then did she speak, voice low but unwavering, as she looked toward the stairs where Amara now leaned against the railing. I don't need anyone's permission to be whole, baby. The world will measure you by headlines, but music will always measure you by truth. She rose, crossed the room, and scooped Amara into her arms. With Marcus at her side, she whispered into her daughter's hair, Mommy doesn't need their applause anymore. She just needed to remember she's still herself. And in that quiet declaration lay the purest victory of the night, untouched by politics, unspoiled by cynics, carried only by the simple, undeniable power of a song reclaimed. Marcus kissed her forehead, Amara's eyes drifted shut, and as Jasmine switched off the lamp, the darkness felt gentle, not threatening, because somewhere outside critics might still debate her motives, and pundits might still question her ideology. But inside this small home, a single truth rang louder than any viral clip. The girl who once played in a Dallas apartment for her grandmother had survived every attempt to silence her, and tonight, with family as her only audience, she had finally played for no one but herself. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time Jasmine guided her hybrid through the sleepy grid of Capitol Hill, wipers scraping rhythmically while street lamps cast liquid amber across the windshield. And with every block she left behind, another layer of adrenaline seemed to peel away, replaced by a fatigue so deep it felt cellular. She pulled into the narrow alley behind their townhouse, killed the engine, and sat in the hush that followed, listening to the ticking of the cooling motor, the distant siren echoing off brick, and her own pulse finally dropping from a snare drum gallop to a steady, muted thump. When she stepped out, night air kissed the sweat at her hairline, and she exhaled as though releasing the last echoes of that ballroom. The chandelier glare, Ethan's smirk, the phones raised like judgment. She slipped her key into the back door, careful not to rattle it, but the squeak of the hinge announced her anyway, and Marcus appeared at the kitchen archway, tall, rumpled from grading essays, eyes bright behind wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the faint blue of the stove clock. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he opened his arms and let her step into them, holding her with the reverence of a man who understood both the cost of public triumph and the necessity of private refuge. She felt the rise and fall of his chest, the subtle tremor in his breath that told her he'd watched the viral clip more than once, felt the room's tension as if he'd been there, and she realized the performance had traveled faster than she had. Without a word, he brushed damp curls from her forehead, kissed the place where a headache had started, then led her through the living room cluttered with colored pencils, history textbooks, and a half-finished cardboard diorama of the Civil War that Amara had left on the coffee table. In the corner, beneath a crocheted throw and a layer of dust, sat their spinet piano, wood dulled, middle C forever slightly flat, yet still radiating the promise of sound. Jasmine hesitated, fingertips grazing the worn edge, and for an instant she saw herself at 8, feet dangling, grandmother's hand guiding hers. That memory, fresh, fierce, drew her onto the bench with a gravity no applause could match. Marcus lowered himself to the couch, elbows on knees, watching with a hush so complete it felt sacred, while the refrigerator hummed a bass line and the house settled around them like a protective cloak. She lifted the fallboard and let her fingers rest on keys that felt cooler than she remembered, as if time had stored up chill in the ivory. And the first chord she struck was little more than a whisper. A Maj 7, suspended in the dark, yet it carried enough resonance to thread through the hallway, up the stairs, and into every room where her campaign posters, policy binders, and unanswered emails slept. She took a slow breath, found the opening voicing of Georgia on my mind, and let it bloom, not with the precision she'd wielded at the gala, but with an intimacy that softened each interval, turning the bluesy bends into sighs rather than declarations. The house seemed to lean closer, floorboards settling, radiators ticking, as though it, too, needed to hear this quieter truth. Halfway through the verse, she modulated unexpectedly, a detour she'd once practiced as a teenager, descending chromatically, then resolving into a lush, gospel-inflected cadence her grandmother used to call "coming home." Marcus's shoulders eased, his eyes glimmered with unshed relief, because he could see the tension leaving her wrists, see the combat mask sliding away note by note. Upstairs, a soft thud. Amara's bedroom door cracked open, and the small figure in unicorn pajamas padded to the banister, curls haloed by nightlight glow. Jasmine's left hand dropped an octave, laying down a velvet bass line. Her right spun a counter melody so tender even the old spinet seemed to forget its age, each key answering her touch with surprising warmth. She glanced up, met her daughter's drowsy gaze, and played a blues turnaround that felt like a promise. "Your mother's still here, still whole, still singing." By the time she reached the song's bridge, the living room felt transformed. No longer a cluttered family space, but a sanctuary where every imperfection, out-of-tune string, chipped veneer, frayed bench cushion, contributed to the honesty of the sound. She sustained the final G-Maj 9 chord until the overtones shimmered and vanished, then let her hands drift to her lap, palms tingling, pulse steady, mind startlingly clear. The quiet that followed was not the brittle silence of judgment she'd faced under crystal chandeliers. It was the deep, velvet hush of completion, the kind that settles after a storm passes and the world waits to breathe again. Marcus rose, crossed the room in 2 strides, and knelt beside her, resting a hand over hers, their wedding rings clinking softly. "You were extraordinary," he whispered, voice thick, but she shook her head with a gentle smile. Because extraordinary wasn't the point. Truthful was. Amara descended the stairs, blanket trailing, and climbed onto Jasmine's lap without asking, curling against her mother's chest. Jasmine pressed a kiss to her daughter's crown, inhaling the scent of sleep and bubblegum shampoo, and felt something inside her align, like a bone set back into place. She looked at Marcus, eyes shimmering in the lamplight, then down at the sleepy child, whose breathing already matched the piano's vanished rhythm. In that moment, she understood that the gala, the confrontation, the viral praise, none of it mattered as much as this fragile hush, this reclaiming of her own voice for the people who loved her without conditions. She stroked a stray curl from Amara's cheek and spoke softly, more to herself than to either of them. "I don't need anyone's approval anymore. I just needed to know I'm still me." Marcus exhaled, a sound of relief and pride entwined, and wrapped his arms around both of them, the three forming a quiet constellation in the glow of the single lamp. Outside, the drizzle strengthened, tapping the window in syncopation, but inside, the only rhythm was the steady cadence of breathing, the faint after ring of strings still vibrating in the piano's wooden heart. Down the street, a distant siren wailed and faded, a reminder that the city never truly slept. Yet within these walls, time had paused to honor a different kind of triumph, one without headlines or hashtags, one measured in the softness of a child's sigh and the weightless ease settling into Jasmine's shoulders. She pictured tomorrow's news cycle, pundits dissecting her performance, allies cheering, critics grasping for fresh angles. But the prospect no longer tightened her chest. She would meet whatever came with the same clarity that had guided her hands tonight. For now she stood, lifting Amara into Marcus's waiting arms, and together they climbed the stairs. In the hallway, campaign flyers leaned against framed finger paintings. Law books shared shelves with picture books, and somewhere between those worlds, Jasmine found balance. She tucked Amara back into bed, hummed the song's opening line as a lullaby, and watched her daughter's lashes flutter closed. Then she whispered once more, so softly only the darkness heard, "Mommy doesn't need the world to clap. Mommy just needs to play." And downstairs, the old piano, keys still warm, seemed to agree, holding its silence like a secret kept safe until the next time she chose to speak through music rather than words. The hush that followed Jasmine's final chord was not an ending, but a hinge, swinging the story from spectacle to significance. And what emerged in that pivot is a lesson too urgent to package into a neat proverb. Her journey shows that oppression often hides behind manners, smiling donors, polished banter, polite invitations meant to expose you, and the only antidote is a voice that refuses to shrink to the size of someone else's comfort. She walked into a ballroom engineered for her humiliation, and when she refused to break, she revealed the hidden blueprint of every rigged arena. Rules that bend for the powerful and tighten for the rest. In that exposure lies the first moral. Systems crack when confronted by authenticity, because authenticity forces onlookers to choose between confronting their bias or clinging to it. And most people, when shown the gap, will step over to the side of truth. So the first takeaway is simple yet seismic. Your honesty can detonate a room built on pretense, even if your hands shake when you strike the match. But the story does more than name injustice. It maps the terrain of resistance, proving that courage is rarely loud in its early stages. Jasmine's initial mistake, the note that faltered, was the precise moment when many would have fled, yet it became the fulcrum of her triumph because she stayed. The lesson here is counterintuitive. Stumbling can be a strategic pause if you refuse to let shame close the door, because the crowd's laughter is never as fatal as the silence of your own retreat. Her grandmother's voice reminded her that performance is secondary to remembrance, and that memory is a weapon no audience can disarm. In that sense, personal history becomes armor, not baggage. Thus, the second moral crystallizes. Your past, especially the parts dismissed as irrelevant or indulgent, might be the exact tool you need to puncture the present's oppressive script. The night also exposes the fragile vanity of gatekeepers like Ethan, who rely on inherited authority rather than earned respect, revealing that elitism often collapses at the first sign of genuine talent. His smirk was currency only as long as everyone else accepted its value. Once Jasmine shifted the exchange rate by demonstrating undeniable skill, his wealth of arrogance became counterfeit. Here lies a third lesson. False superiority withers in the presence of authentic excellence, and those who trade in sneers are bankrupt the moment real substance enters the room. That knowledge empowers anyone facing institutional bias, artists, workers, students, to realize the gate is held shut not by steel, but by collective illusion. Break the illusion, and the gate swings open on its own rusted hinges. Equally important is what happens off stage, where Jasmine's influence ripples through unseen lives. The truck stop guitarist, the veteran tapping rhythms on a dented table, the factory welder retrieving a harmonica from a dusty drawer. Their awakenings illustrate the exponential power of representation. A single act of defiance can reactivate dormant dreams across thousands of miles and countless hearts. Society often underestimates quiet spectators, yet they are the tinder waiting for a spark, and Jasmine's spark ignites them because it is rooted in sincerity, not branding. The moral here is communal. When you reclaim your voice, you grant silent permission for others to seek theirs, and that chain reaction is how cultures shift. Therefore, the narrative insists that personal victories are never merely personal. They are blueprints for collective resurrection. Another layer of meaning emerges in Jasmine's return home, where the public triumph dissolves into a private lullaby, reminding us that success measured by external applause is incomplete without inner peace. Her choice to replay the song for herself, without cameras, without critics, teaches that true validation is an internal echo, not a headline. Injustice often trains marginalized people to perform ceaselessly for approval. Yet Jasmine's quiet living room recital reframes success as self-alignment rather than external endorsement. This is the fourth lesson. Your worth is self-referential, and the moment you anchor it internally, the world's fickle applause loses its power to sway your sense of identity. Freedom begins where the need for permission ends. The narrative also indicts the subtle violence of low expectations, a cruelty that masquerades as doubt but functions as a preemptive strike on potential. The donor's bets, the journalist's smirks, these were not harmless jokes. They were psychological barricades erected to keep Jasmine small. When she dismantled them, she illustrated a fifth principle. The greatest rebellion against prejudice is excellence in the very arena built to prove your inadequacy. Each perfectly executed chord was a counter-argument no op-ed could refute, a data point against every stereotype that tried to confine her. Thus, the story commands us to weaponize mastery against bias, turning skill into protest. Ethan's final, bitter tweet, "She played well, but her politics are still wrong," serves as a cautionary coda about the limits of ego. His concession cloaked in contempt underscores how insecurity clings to semantics when confronted by undeniable achievement. From his defeat, we learn that refusing to acknowledge another's humanity ultimately diminishes your own. The audience forgot Ethan's resume the moment he exposed his pettiness. So the sixth takeaway is stark. Humility in the face of greatness elevates you. Spite imprisons you in a shrinking room of your own making. In a society that rewards hot takes over reflection, Ethan's silence becomes a parable about the cost of clinging to arrogance. The role of memory in the tale cannot be overstated. Jasmine's grandmother is the unseen architect of her resilience, proving that ancestral wisdom can outlast generational oppression. When institutions attempt to sever people from their roots, they weaken them. When individuals reconnect to those roots, they grow unbreakable. This seventh lesson urges us to honor lineage as a source of tactical strength, not nostalgic ornament. Every whispered encouragement from the past can become a battle cry in the present if we choose to hear it. In that sense, memory is both map and compass. Moreover, the story interrogates the intersection of art and politics, illustrating that creativity is not a luxury detached from social struggle, but a front line where narratives are contested and power redefined. Jasmine's performance was political precisely because it refused the boundaries set for her. It argued that art is a domain where marginalized voices can rewrite societal scripts in real time. Hence the eighth lesson. Wielding creativity in spaces that deem you unworthy is a direct challenge to the hierarchy of value, and every audience forced to confront that creativity must either evolve or reveal its prejudice. Art, therefore, is not escape, it is confrontation. The night's events also expose how technology amplifies authenticity faster than manufactured scandal. The shaky phone video of Jasmine traveled farther and touched deeper than any polished press release could, reminding us that audiences crave genuine moments over curated personas. Thus, Lesson 9, in an age of perpetual performance, authenticity remains the rarest and most magnetic currency, and those who dare to trade in it can outpace even the most sophisticated propaganda. This democratization of narrative empowers anyone with a story to bypass gatekeepers entirely. Injustice hates open channels because truth moves quicker than spin. Finally, the most profound message may be the simplest. Music, like any sincere act, transcends divisions that rhetoric cannot bridge. In the ballroom, party lines blurred as melody took precedence. In living rooms across America, hardened men felt something stir that political speeches never reached. That is Lesson 10. Shared humanity often reveals itself in the spaces where words end. And if we want to mend our fractured society, we must nurture those wordless spaces through art, empathy, and the courage to show vulnerability before we show conviction. Jasmine's piano didn't change policies, but it changed people, and people change policies. Taken together, these lessons form a single, pulsing directive. Refuse the roles written to limit you, reclaim the tools that once gave you joy, turn your authenticity into a battering ram against systems that underestimate you. And remember that the moment you do, you not only free yourself, you loosen the chains on countless others who have been waiting for proof that liberation is possible. Because in the final analysis, the story of Jasmine Crockett versus Ethan Drake is not about a piano duel at a DC gala. It is about the unbreakable truth that the human spirit, once it remembers its own music, can drown out every chorus of doubt. And that truth, ringing clear through the halls of power in the quiet of a family home, is the most breathtaking, heart-pounding, and necessary song we can carry into the world. So now the spotlight swings from Jasmine Steinway to you, because a story this explosive is only half-lived if it ends on a screen instead of detonating in real life. Ask yourself, right now, before the credits roll, what instrument, canvas, notebook, or half-finished blueprint have you buried under bills, schedules, and other people's expectations? Picture it in vivid color, feel the dust on your fingertips, and remember how your pulse used to race when you touched it. That forgotten passion is not a hobby. It's a weapon against every gatekeeper who says you are only as valuable as your productivity, your party line, or your paycheck. Tonight, make a promise as unbreakable as Jasmine's final chord. Dig that dream out, tune it, and play it. Badly at first, loudly if you must, because the act of beginning is already an act of rebellion. If you're a veteran with calloused hands, drum on the kitchen table until the rhythm returns. If you're a factory worker on the night shift, whistle the melody you wrote at 17 and let it echo down the corridor. If you're a retiree who once sketched portraits on lunch breaks, sharpen that pencil and let graphite become testimony. The world will tell you it has no time for your softness, but softness is where revolutions learn to breathe, and every note, brushstroke, or sentence you reclaim is a crack in the wall that kept you silent. Do not wait for applause. Applause is fickle and arrives late. Wait only for the spark of recognition in your own chest, the moment you realize you're still alive in ways you'd forgotten. And when that spark catches, share it. Post the rough recording, hang the imperfect painting, read the unfinished poem at an open mic, because authenticity multiplies when exposed to air. Remember, the gala crowd thought Jasmine would crumble, but she rewrote the room's gravity. You can rewrite the gravity of your own life, and someone watching, someone who has also buried their fire, will follow your lead. Next, aim your reclaimed creativity like a spotlight at the systems that underestimated you. Compose a protest song that names the boardroom where diversity is a buzzword but not a practice. Choreograph a dance that mimics the stop and frisk you endured. Build a mural on the side of a forgotten warehouse that tells the story the local news refuses to cover. Art is not decoration, it is confrontation dressed in beauty. And every time you wield it, you force power to acknowledge the humanity it tried to render invisible. Write letters to the editor, cite Jasmine's example, and demand funding for music programs in schools that politicians strip to pad budgets. Organize a neighborhood jam session so kids learn that stage lights belong to them too. Volunteer at the community center to teach the chords you just relearned, turning your personal revival into a public resource. If you have influence, be it a classroom, a congregation, or a YouTube channel, use it to amplify voices still trembling at the microphone. Refuse to let gatekeepers define excellence. Build alternate stages in parking lots, barber shops, and backyards where truth can thunder without permission. And if cynics sneer the way Ethan did, meet their smirk with mastery. Let your craft be so sharp it slices their doubt mid-sentence. Every performance in an unexpected place is a small earthquake in the status quo, and enough small quakes level empires. Finally, protect the spark you reignite, because the world is relentless in its demand for conformity. Set boundaries like Barlene's. Carve out 30 minutes a day when the phone is off, the newsfeed is silent, and the only voice that matters is the one that rises from your instrument or page. Surround yourself with allies, other late bloomers, recovering dreamers, fearless beginners, people who clap on the first off-key note because they know how hard it is to start. When doubt creeps in, remember Jasmine's first flawed chord and how the room sharpened its knives. Remember that she did not stop, and neither will you. Keep a journal of every small victory, the day the melody finally flowed, the night a stranger thanked you for a sketch you almost threw away, the morning you woke up excited instead of exhausted. Those notes are proof against the next wave of dismissal that will inevitably come. And if someday you find yourself in a ballroom of your own, facing eyes that expect failure, think of Jasmine. Breathe once, touch the keys, and let the truth inside you ring out so clearly that even your enemies fall silent. Because the real finale of her story is unwritten. It lives in what you choose to do after the screen fades to black. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Jasmine Crockett walked into a luxury car dealership with $280,000 in hand. But within just 5 minutes, she was insulted and thrown out the door. The manager thought he had won, smug in the belief that he'd removed someone who didn't belong in his world. But less than 24 hours later, Marcus Crockett, her husband, pulled up in a blazing red Rolls-Royce and flipped the entire script with one condition no one could refuse. Can a single action, done at the right moment, in the right way, truly change a person? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The sun was fading over Washington, D.C., casting a pale light over empty sidewalks and traffic lights blinking on. Jasmine Crockett had just left a tense hearing at the Capitol, her voice still echoing in the chamber, her pulse steady. She didn't head home. Instead, she drove herself to Capital Star Motors, one of the most exclusive car dealerships in the city, known for catering to powerful people with deep pockets. She wasn't there to browse. She came with purpose. To buy the Mercedes-AMG S63 Coupe, silver, strong, nearly $280,000. Dressed in a clean navy pantsuit, her steps were confident but calm. Around her neck hung a thin silver chain, barely visible, engraved with two simple words, truth over fear. It wasn't for show, it was a reminder. Inside, the showroom sparkled, quiet and polished. She walked straight toward the car she wanted, unaware that her name and everything it stood for was about to become a problem for someone who didn't think she belonged. She had just laid her hand on the hood of the Mercedes when a voice broke the stillness. "Good afternoon, ma'am. It's a pleasure to help you today," the young man said with a bright, respectful tone. Jasmine turned to see him, early 20s, clean-cut, clearly new to the job. His name tag read Tyler and his suit didn't quite fit, but his attitude made up for it. He held a tablet close to his chest, trying his best to look confident. "If you're interested in the S63, I can walk you through anything you'd like," he added, motioning gently to the car as if inviting her to explore, not sell. Jasmine gave him a slight smile. It was rare to be greeted without an ounce of judgment, especially in a city where names came with baggage. For one short moment, the world felt simple, respectful, normal. But before Tyler could finish his sentence, the air in the room shifted, like someone had dropped the temperature without touching the thermostat. There was a pause, so brief most wouldn't notice. But Jasmine felt it instantly. It was the kind of silence that comes not from emptiness, but from expectation. Someone was watching. Then came the sound, slow, confident footsteps clicking across the glossy showroom tile. A man appeared from behind a glass office partition, walking like he had nowhere to be, yet every right to interrupt. Graham Ellis. His name tag said sales manager, but his body language screamed something else, authority mixed with quiet entitlement. He was in his mid-40s, lean but stiff in his movements, like someone who had taught himself posture from expensive seminars. His suit fit well, dark gray, not flashy, but just enough to say, "I'm above this." His polished shoes left faint echoes behind him. He didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. His eyes scanned the scene, the car, Tyler, then Jasmine. But when his gaze landed on the silver chain around her neck, he stopped. 3 words were etched there, truth over fear, small enough to miss, but not for him. That was all he needed. His face didn't twist, didn't sneer. That would be too obvious. No, his change was subtle. The corners of his mouth pressed together. His head tilted ever so slightly. His eyes narrowed, not in surprise, but in recognition. And then he stepped forward. "Excuse me, Tyler," he said, cutting between the young salesman and Jasmine, like they weren't even there. "I'll take it from here." Tyler hesitated, one foot still angled toward Jasmine. But Graham didn't wait for him to move. He turned fully toward her now, folding his hands in front of him like a principal about to give a lecture. "You're Jasmine Crockett, aren't you?" he asked, voice steady, lips barely parting. "Congresswoman, right?" Jasmine looked him in the eye, silent. "Democrat," he continued, the word hanging in the air just a fraction longer than necessary. It wasn't a greeting, it was a warning, and it landed hard. It was the tone, not what he said, but how he said it. Neutral on the surface, but lined with quiet disdain, like he was trying to figure out whether she was lost, joking, or simply didn't understand where she was. Like this wasn't her space to walk into. There was no offer of help. No welcome to Capital Star Motors. Just the implication, clear as day. You don't belong here. Tyler took a small step back, lips parted as if to say something. then thought better of it. He could feel it too now, that unspoken shift in atmosphere. The manager hadn't raised his voice, but somehow everything felt louder, tighter. The soft jazz playing overhead suddenly felt out of place, like music playing during a fire alarm. He let out a soft laugh, sharp and humorless. "You know what's funny?" he said, voice louder now. "People like you, always on TV, always preaching about the little guy, the poor, the broken system, then show up to buy a Mercedes that costs more than a teacher makes in 5 years." He nodded slowly, as if trying to convince himself of something. "Must be nice. All that fighting for the people really pays off, huh?" Jasmine stood still, her eyes locked on his. She said nothing. She didn't need to. His words were spilling fast now. He'd cracked open the door and couldn't stop himself. "Let me guess," he continued. "Campaign funds? Political donors? Or just a little off-the-books bonus for voting the right way?" He chuckled again, and this time it was louder. More people heard it. 2 junior sales guys over by the front desk looked up. One of them smirked. The other shook his head. Graham took a step closer, not aggressive, just invasive enough to show he wasn't afraid. "It's always the same story," he said. "You talk about fairness, equality, lifting people up, but the second you get a taste of money, of power, suddenly it's leather seats and German engineering, isn't it?" He motioned to the S63 coupe behind her. "You know what this car is? This car is for people who understand where they are, who play the game right, who earn their place." He looked her up and down again, not with interest but with judgment. Not people who show up thinking slogans and speeches are enough. Tyler finally took a slow step back, shoulders tense. He wasn't trained for this. Nobody had told him what to do when a manager decides to insult a sitting member of Congress. But Graham didn't care who Jasmine was. Or maybe he did, and that was the problem. He shook his head as if disappointed in her personally. "I don't care what title you've got, Congresswoman," he said. "You walk into a place like this wearing that little necklace." He pointed lightly at her pendant, truth over fear, "and acting like you belong. That's bold." Then he smiled finally. It wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile you wear when you think you've just put someone in their place. But bold doesn't mean welcome. And with that, he turned slightly, as if he were already done, as if the decision had been made. "You don't belong here, and I've made sure everyone knows it." Graham's last words hung in the air like a challenge, smug and final, as if he'd delivered the closing line of a play he thought he'd already won. Jasmine stood completely still. Her body didn't tense. She didn't roll her eyes, she didn't scoff, because she'd been here before. Maybe not in this exact room, not in front of this exact man, but in this exact moment, where someone in a position of just enough power tries to make you feel small, where disrespect is slipped into conversation like it's just business, where you're pushed to react because your reaction will become the real problem. She inhaled slowly once, then she spoke. "I'm here as a customer," she said calmly, clearly, eyes locked onto his. "Not a politician." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The way she said it, measured, grounded, made every syllable ring louder than anything Graham had thrown at her. "I came in because I liked the car. I didn't bring a camera crew. I didn't bring press. I didn't bring politics. You brought that into the room the second you opened your mouth." Graham shifted slightly, not backing down but no longer leaning in. His posture froze. Not defensive, but not as smug as before. Jasmine took one slow step forward, not threatening but firm. Her presence filled the space in a way no shouting ever could. "I don't owe you a breakdown of my bank account," she said. "I don't need to explain why I can afford this car or justify how I spend what I've earned. I didn't come here to debate my integrity. I came here to buy a machine, not be measured like one." She paused, letting it settle. Tyler, off to the side, silent till now, shifted his weight, swallowing hard. He wasn't sure what to do, but even he could feel it. The temperature in the room had changed. Jasmine had taken back the ground under her feet. "If you had a problem with my politics," she added, voice tightening just slightly, "you could have kept that to yourself. But you chose to make it personal. You wanted to remind me that this space, this showroom, This car, its price, wasn't meant for people like me. The silence that followed Jasmine's words was heavy, not empty, but loaded. You could feel it pressing against the windows. Tyler didn't move. He looked down at his shoes, like they might offer instructions. A few of the other employees drifted farther into the background, not out of respect, but avoidance. No one wanted to be part of what was coming. Jasmine, she was still standing there, calm, composed, but her patience had an edge now, and Graham felt it. He said it like it was a policy, like it was printed on the back of the showroom wall. But it wasn't. It was personal. Everyone could feel it. Our brand, he continued, caters to a very specific kind of client. Professional, traditional, tasteful. The way he said that last word, tasteful, dripped with quiet insult. Like Jasmine didn't belong simply because she wasn't wearing the right kind of privilege. He glanced at her necklace again, truth over fear, as if that alone was proof she was out of place. Then he folded his arms, head tilted, a fake expression of regret plastered across his face. "You've made your point. Now I'm making mine," he said. "You're not welcome here, Congresswoman. I'm asking you to leave." A pause, no movement, no reaction, just that chilling stillness again. Then came the final, deliberate blow. "If you choose not to, I'll have security escort you out." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That was the real strategy. He wanted everyone to hear her being removed, but no one to hear him remove her. His words were dressed in formality, but the intent was as raw as it gets. "You don't belong here. You never did. Now get out." The injustice wasn't loud. It was polite, polished, and practiced, and that's what made it so cruel. Jasmine didn't move right away. Her spine stayed straight, shoulders square. No emotion cracked her face, but something behind her eyes shifted, something subtle. Not defeat, but finality, like a door had just closed, not behind her, but on them. She turned her head slowly, looked once more at the car she had come to see, the one she wasn't even allowed to touch, and then turned back toward the glass doors. She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. Her heels clicked across the marble, each step crisp and measured. Not rushed, not angry, just done. The kind of walk that says, "You didn't win, you revealed yourself." Tyler, still standing a few feet away, looked pale. His eyes met hers for a second, and he whispered just loud enough for her to hear. I'm sorry." She paused at the door, looked at him. No smile, just a simple, quiet nod. The kind you give someone who almost did the right thing. Then she pushed through the door and stepped back out into the cold. The wind met her like it had been waiting, sharp, fast, and real. She walked across the mostly empty parking lot, passing rows of polished machines that gleamed in the showroom's reflection like trophies in glass cages. Her car, the Honda Accord, sat parked near the far end, where the shadows stretched longer. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't new, but it was hers. It had gotten her through law school, campaigns, late-night flights, and early morning strategy calls. And now, it was where she went to breathe. She slid into the driver's seat and closed the door with quiet hands. No slamming, no sighing, just stillness. She stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel lightly, her face unreadable. The cold from the outside hadn't left her coat yet, but what chilled her wasn't the weather. It was what had just happened. She could still hear Graham's voice, his fake calm tone, the way he used brand values as a weapon, like she'd violated a dress code instead of being humiliated. She remembered the way he looked at her necklace, like it said something offensive instead of something true. She remembered the fake chuckle about taxpayer money, the way two employees laughed along quietly, the room full of bystanders who said nothing. She finally blinked, reached into her coat, pulled out her phone, unlocked. One contact, Marcus Crockett. She hit call. It didn't even ring twice. "Jazz?" His voice came through, low, calm, but alert, like he already knew something was wrong. She didn't hold back. "I went to the dealership," she said, her voice level, but clipped at the edges. "I wanted to look at the Mercedes, the S63, the one we talked about. I walked in, was greeted by a new kid. Sweet, nervous, probably 22. Name was Tyler. He was nice. Actually nice. Treated me like a real customer. She paused, then added, for about 90 seconds. Marcus stayed quiet on the line. Then the manager came over. Graham Ellis, mid-40s, slick suit, slick smile. He saw me, looked at my necklace. Didn't say anything at first, then he realized who I was. Called me out, loud enough for other people to hear. Her voice remained steady, but there was an edge now. Tight, thin, razor sharp. He asked if I was Congresswoman Crockett, Democrat. Like that was an offense. She shook her head slowly. Then it started. The usual. Said it was funny someone like me wanted a car like that. Said maybe I was using campaign donations or taxpayer money. Said the dealership catered to a specific kind of client. You know what he meant. Marcus breathed once, slow and deep. Then he told me I didn't belong there. And when I didn't walk out fast enough, he said he'd call security. She added, not yelled, not screamed, just calmly, like he was asking me to take off muddy shoes before stepping into a rich man's house. There was another long pause. Jasmine could almost see her husband's expression forming on the other end of the line. He didn't get angry often, not in ways people expected. He didn't yell. He calculated. And Jasmine knew that tone. When he went quiet like this, it wasn't calm. It was controlled. I know exactly what I need to do. And that was it. Not a single question, not a single doubt. Jasmine leaned back in the seat, her breath finally breaking the silence inside the car. The windows had started fogging from the contrast of her warmth and the outside chill. She didn't wipe them. She let them blur. Because whatever Graham Ellis thought he had accomplished by making her walk out that door, whatever superiority he felt for putting her in her place, he had no idea what she had just set in motion. The next morning, Capital Star Motors opened its glass doors like any other weekday. The sky was overcast, the streets quiet, and inside, the showroom buzzed with soft chatter and the hum of sales talk layered over jazz music. Graham Ellis, rested and self-assured, stood near the central display, reviewing specs on a tablet while making small talk with a couple eyeing a Bentley Continental. He wore a fresh suit, light gray with a deep blue pocket square, and the same smug energy he carried every day, especially after a so-called win like the day before. He hadn't said much to the staff about the incident, just shrugged it off. Some people just don't fit the brand, he had muttered, half laughing. And then, without warning, the temperature in the showroom seemed to drop, not by the thermostat, but by instinct. A sound rolled in from outside, not loud, not urgent, but deep, solid. A low, velvety engine growl, tuned so perfectly it sounded more like a heartbeat than machinery. A few heads near the windows turned. One of the junior associates leaned forward against the glass, brow rising. A Rolls-Royce Phantom, crimson red, black trim, chrome so polished it mirrored the sky, glided across the dealership's private drive like it owned the pavement. It didn't park. It arrived. When the engine faded into silence, it wasn't just quiet. It was deliberate, intentional. Everyone looked. Inside, Tyler, standing near the reception desk, froze mid-sentence. His eyes widened the second the door to the Phantom opened. Then came Marcus Crockett. He stepped out with no rush, no show. He didn't need theatrics. His presence carried weight the way old buildings carry history. Solid, unmoving, impossible to ignore. His charcoal gray suit was tailored to precision, the coat slightly unbuttoned. He wore no tie, just a crisp white collar open at the throat, like someone who'd walked out of a war room, not a boardroom. He didn't pause to look around. He didn't need to orient himself. He knew exactly where he was going. And the moment he stepped through the glass doors, the room changed. Not immediately, not loudly, but absolutely. Conversation stopped mid-word. Clients lowered their voices without realizing why. The showroom's carefully curated atmosphere of calm luxury cracked at the edges. Not because Marcus said anything, but because of what he carried with him. Presence, purpose, and pressure. He walked like a man who had no interest in introductions, only outcomes. Graham, still by the Bentley, glanced casually over his shoulder at first, expecting a new high-profile client to charm. But the second his eyes landed on Marcus, the color in his face began to fade. He tried to fix his expression, tried to square his shoulders, but his hand tightened around the edge of the tablet without him noticing. His smirk evaporated. The posture stayed, but the confidence behind it had cracked. Tyler, now standing to the side, whispered under his breath, "Oh my God," and stepped slightly back, as if he knew something bigger than a sale was about to unfold. Marcus didn't stop. His gaze was locked on one person. No glances left or right, no greetings, no smiles. He reached the center of the showroom, directly across from Graham, and came to a slow, deliberate stop. He said nothing, but he didn't need to. Every person in that room knew the power had just shifted, and it wasn't subtle. Graham stood rooted in place as Marcus closed the distance between them, each step purposeful, heavy with intent. He tried to hold on to the performance, chin up, shoulders square, but his eyes betrayed him. That same confidence he had worn the day before, like a badge, was fading by the second. Marcus stopped just a few feet away, posture relaxed but unreadable. His voice came low and calm, not a threat, but a reckoning. "You didn't turn my wife away yesterday because she couldn't afford the car," he said, locking his gaze on Graham. "You turned her away because you couldn't stand who she is." Graham shifted. "That's not fair," he said quickly, a nervous chuckle in his throat. "She came in with an attitude." "No," Marcus cut in, not louder, just sharper. "She came in with confidence. You mistook that for something else. Or maybe you just couldn't stand the sight of it." Graham lifted his hands halfway, defensive now. "Look, I didn't know who she was at first. And when I realized—" "That was the problem," Marcus interrupted, eyes unblinking. "You recognized her, and instead of offering her the same respect you give every other wealthy customer that walks through those doors, you chose to humiliate her." Graham straightened, trying to recover. "I was trying to protect the integrity of the brand. We serve a very specific clientele." Marcus took a step closer. His voice dropped lower. "You mean white. You mean traditional. You mean compliant. Don't dress it up. You saw a woman who didn't fit your picture of who should own a six-figure car, and instead of adjusting your picture, you decided to make her feel like she was the one out of place." Graham's tone turned defensive, tight. "That's not what happened. I have the right to refuse service. It's nothing personal." Marcus's face stayed stone calm. "It was entirely personal. You called her out by name. You made a scene. You questioned her finances, her profession, her integrity." "She was wearing that necklace," Graham said quickly. "Truth over fear, right? That's political." Marcus didn't flinch. "It's principle, something you clearly confuse with partisanship." He stepped forward again, still not threatening, just utterly immovable. "My wife isn't just a congresswoman. She's a civil rights attorney who's fought for people you'll never understand. She's been harassed, doxxed, targeted, and yet she walked in here, on her own, expecting to be treated like a customer, not a problem." Graham was quiet now, cornered not by volume, but by facts. "You don't have to vote for her. You don't have to like her policies, but the moment you use your job to try and humiliate her for what she represents, you crossed a line." Marcus's voice hardened, not louder, just colder, like stone closing around a truth. "You don't get to weaponize customer service to push people out. You don't get to use polite words to hide real hate. And you definitely don't get to make my wife feel small, because she had the nerve to walk in here with pride in who she is." The silence in the showroom was now absolute. No phones rang, no keys clacked, no footsteps moved. Even Tyler, standing frozen at the edge of the floor, barely seemed to breathe. Graham's mouth was slightly open, but no words came. The excuses had run out, because Marcus Crockett hadn't raised his voice. He had just taken back the room. The silence that followed Marcus's final words was thick enough to stop time. It pressed down on every corner of the showroom, making even the air feel heavier. No one dared to speak, not the clients still frozen near the display cars, not the junior sales staff, and certainly not Graham Ellis. And then, footsteps, measured, expensive, the kind that announce power before the man himself arrives. From a hallway off the private offices, a new figure stepped into view. Mid-60s, tall, lean, navy blue suit, salt white hair, glasses like a signature. This was Clarence Devlin, owner of Capital Star Motors, the man who didn't show up unless something was at stake. And clearly, something was. "Mr. Crockett," he said smoothly, extending a hand, "I'm Clarence Devlin. I understand there's been some misunderstanding." Marcus didn't move at first. He looked Clarence up and down, assessing not the suit, but intent. Then slowly he shook the man's hand. Firm brief, no smile. "Mr. Devlin," Marcus said, "this isn't a misunderstanding. It was crystal clear." Clarence nodded once, eyes flicking to Graham, who looked like he wanted to disappear. "I assure you we don't condone that kind of behavior here. I'll speak to my staff personally." "I'm not here for apologies," Marcus replied calmly. "I came for accountability." The words settled with a chill. Clarence blinked, but didn't interrupt. "I'm still willing to buy the car. The exact model my wife came in for, the S63 Coupe. No discounts, no handouts. I'll pay in full today, as she intended yesterday. But it will come with one condition. Your sales manager, Mr. Ellis, will attend a gala next week. It's called Unity and Honor, fundraiser for disabled veterans. My wife is hosting it. She helped build it. It's not political, it's human." Clarence's posture shifted. He was doing math, calculating risk. "If he agrees," Marcus said, "we close the sale today, clean, professional. If he refuses, I walk out, and every client I work with, from Boston to San Diego, will hear exactly what happened here. I don't need headlines. I just need a phone call, maybe two. I'm still willing to buy the car," he said. "The exact model my wife came in for. The S63 Coupe. No discounts, no handouts. I'll pay in full today, as she intended to yesterday." He paused. "But," he continued, eyes locking on Clarence now, "it will come with one condition." The room held still again. Even Graham's breath caught. Marcus's tone was steady but sharp as steel. "Your sales manager, Mr. Ellis, will attend a gala next week. It's called Unity and Honor. It's a fundraiser for disabled veterans and their families. My wife is hosting it. She helped build it. And it's not political. It's human." Clarence's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted. He was listening now, not like a businessman, but like a man trying to do math on damage. "If he agrees," Marcus said, "we close the sale today, clean, professional." Another pause. Marcus leaned in just slightly, voice lower, colder. "If he refuses, I walk out, and every client I work with, from Boston to San Diego, will hear exactly what happened here. I don't need headlines. I just need one phone call, maybe two." Graham's mouth opened, then shut. His hands clenched behind his back. The blood had left his face. Clarence cleared his throat. "Mr. Crockett, I hope you understand. Our dealership doesn't take sides. We serve everyone equally." "No," Marcus replied instantly. Graham didn't. His words hit like a gavel. "And your silence up until now says plenty about what you were willing to let slide until it got inconvenient." Clarence didn't argue. He didn't have ground to stand on. In the background, Tyler stood near the service counter, his tablet hanging limp in his hands. His eyes were locked on Marcus, not with fear, but something closer to awe. He'd never seen a man take over a room without raising his voice, without flexing, just pure surgical presence. Clarence turned toward Graham. "You'll attend the gala," he said, firm. Not a suggestion, an order. Graham blinked. "Sir, with respect." "This isn't about respect anymore," Clarence cut in. "It's about consequence." Marcus didn't say anything for a moment. He let that land. Then he nodded once. "I'll have the paperwork ready within the hour," he said. Clarence gave a quiet nod, then turned to a nearby assistant and muttered something under his breath. Graham still hadn't moved. Marcus took one last look at him, not with rage, not even with judgment, just cold clarity. "You tried to make my wife feel like she didn't belong," he said. "Now you'll spend one evening face to face with people you don't think count. People who've given more than you ever will. And maybe, just maybe, you'll learn what belonging actually looks like. He didn't wait for a reply. He walked off toward the showroom's central lounge, where Tyler was already fumbling to gather documents, his fingers shaking slightly. The tension lingered behind him like smoke, because everyone knew what had just happened. Marcus Crockett hadn't just bought a car. He'd reset the balance of the entire room. Following the silence Marcus Crockett left behind at the dealership, a different kind of noise began to fill Graham Ellis's life, one he wasn't used to. It wasn't outrage, not scandal, not calls from superiors. It was something quieter, something heavier, reflection. And for the first time in years, he didn't have a script to talk his way through it. When the day of the Unity and Honor Veterans Gala finally arrived, he didn't show up with pride, not with protest, but with reluctant obligation. An oppressed black polo shirt, no name tag, no clipboard, just instructions: assist where needed, be respectful, stay visible. He had wanted to send someone else. Devlin refused, so here he was, inside the glittering ballroom of the Grand Hyatt Washington, its chandeliers glowing like frozen fire above a crowd he never thought he'd stand among. No sales floor, no branding, just people. American flags lined the stage. Rows of round tables were dressed in deep navy cloth, flanked by gold-backed chairs, and seated at many of them, the men and women whose lives had been marked by sacrifice, veterans of every age, some laughing with families, others sitting quietly, wearing medals instead of pride. Graham didn't speak as he moved through the space. He didn't know how. He didn't know what to say to people who had faced things he'd only read about, in articles he never finished. At the registration table, he was handed a volunteer badge and a duty. Assist Mr. Henry Morales, Vietnam-born, American citizen, Purple Heart recipient, Afghanistan combat vet, now in a wheelchair after a roadside IED shredded both his legs near Kandahar. Graham's first instinct was hesitation. He didn't feel qualified. He wasn't. But there was no time to dwell. He found Mr. Morales near the front of the ballroom. Late 60s, deeply tanned skin, square jaw, white crew cut under a navy cap with faded yellow embroidery. 101 St. Airborne. No slack. His hands rested calmly in his lap, knuckles scarred, one finger missing. He looked up at Graham, not with suspicion, not with warmth, just curiosity. "You my ride tonight?" he asked, voice dry but not unkind. "Yes, sir," Graham replied quietly. Henry nodded once. "Then let's roll. They're doing the flag ceremony soon." And so they moved, through polished floors and crowded aisles, past senators in tuxes and women in sequins. Graham didn't say much, neither did Henry, but something about the silence between them felt different, honest. As they reached the front rows, Graham adjusted the angle of the chair, then took a seat behind him, hands resting loosely on his knees. He looked around at the room, this time not as a showroom or a networking hub, but as a place filled with people who didn't ask to be applauded, but who deserved it anyway. On stage, a young woman began to sing the national anthem. The room rose slowly, unevenly, some with strength, others with help. Henry remained seated, but he placed a hand over his chest. When the anthem ended, the speaker took the podium and began to call names. Veterans of specific units, conflicts, and acts of valor. And with every name came applause. Every story came weight. Beside him, Henry would sometimes nod quietly, recognizing a name, a place, a tone in someone's voice. At one point, Henry whispered, "He was in my unit," took shrapnel to the face, still pulled 3 guys out under fire. Graham said nothing, but his jaw tightened. These weren't statistics. They were stories, real ones, carried in bodies that still hurt, memories that still returned at night. Later, while pushing Henry through the reception area toward the banquet hall, Graham finally spoke. "You still talk to any of them?" Henry raised an eyebrow. "My guys?" "Yeah, not all of them. Some drank too much. Some just disappeared. But yeah, a few." Pause. "You?" Graham blinked. "Me? I've never served." Henry smiled faintly. Didn't say served. Said your guys, the ones you show up for. You got any? Graham didn't answer. Not because he didn't have one, but because he'd never thought about it like that, about showing up for anyone, without a paycheck attached. The question stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. As the evening continued, Graham helped distribute programs, poured coffee, fetched extra utensils for older guests, even held a door open for a double amputee Marine named Mike, who cracked a joke about dropping his prosthetic if Graham made a wrong turn. And somewhere in that process, the transactionless kind of service, something shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but it did, because the room was full of people who, by his own assumptions, he'd written off. Men in faded uniforms, women in worn dresses with military pins instead of diamonds, people who didn't ask him where he was from, or what he believed, or what side he voted on. People who treated him kindly, not because he deserved it, but because they chose to. And Graham realized, this was the crowd he thought Jasmine Crockett didn't deserve to be part of. But these were her people. They always had been. She wasn't pretending to fight for America. She was fighting beside the very people he once ignored. Near the end of the night, as the lights dimmed and a final speaker took the stage, a mother who'd lost a son in Ramadi, Graham found himself gripping the handles of Henry's wheelchair a little tighter. The woman's voice was steady, but her story was not. She spoke of a knock on her door, a folded flag, a lifetime of birthdays, with one seat empty. And she ended not with anger, but with a simple message. Sacrifice doesn't come with a party badge. It just comes with love and silence, and sometimes strangers who are willing to listen. When the applause finally rose again, quiet, respectful, Graham didn't clap at first. He stared forward, eyes glossed but dry, chest tight. Henry looked back. Heavy night, huh? Graham nodded slowly. Yeah. You'll remember it, Henry said. You don't have to tell anybody. Just don't forget. As the crowd began to file out, Graham wheeled Henry toward the elevators, past rows of flags and photographs and honor boards. For the first time in a long time, he felt small, in the right way, like someone who had just walked into a room full of giants and had been allowed to stay. He didn't know if it would change everything, but it changed something. And for a man like Graham Ellis, that was already more than anyone expected. The gala was beginning to wind down, but the weight in the room had not lifted. Even as servers quietly cleared tables and a jazz trio played soft closing notes, something sacred still lingered in the air. The kind of silence that follows truth. It wasn't the hush of politeness anymore. It was the sound of hearts working hard to hold emotion in place. Graham stood near the edge of the banquet hall beside Henry Morales' wheelchair. The old veteran had been quieter these last few minutes, his body tired but his eyes still sharp. Graham didn't know what to do with his hands, so he rested them on the back of Henry's chair, unsure whether to stay or disappear into the shadows. He hadn't planned to stay this long. He hadn't expected to feel anything. But now, after the stories, the faces, the folded memories, he was standing in a place he didn't feel he'd earned the right to be in. Then he heard her voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Mr. Ellis. He turned, slowly, carefully. Jasmine Crockett stood a few feet behind him, in a navy blue gown with clean lines and no flash. A single pin rested on her chest, a silver eagle wrapped in ribbon, the insignia of the event. Her hair was pulled back, her posture was calm, and her expression wasn't angry. It was just still. I didn't think you'd come, she said quietly, with a calm that somehow struck deeper than confrontation ever could. Graham looked down, not as a tactic, not in shame. It was simply instinct, because everything he'd believed about her, what she was, what she represented, what she threatened in him, had collapsed in that ballroom over the past 2 hours. When he looked back up, his voice was quieter than usual, stripped of showmanship. Just real. I was wrong, he said, each word deliberate. I thought you were a headline, a symbol, a politician with a platform. He shook his head slightly. But tonight, Tonight I saw the people who trust you. I saw the room you built, the voices you stand with. And I realized your name isn't what gives you power. Your heart does. He paused, then added softly, I didn't want to see it before, because if I saw it, I'd have to admit how little I understood. Jasmine didn't react right away. She stood still, watching him, not as an adversary, not even as a skeptic, just present, as if weighing whether to believe the words or the man. And then from the side of the conversation came a voice deeper than both. Ma'am, Henry Morales said, shifting in his wheelchair, glancing up with a small, dry smile. I know this guy messed up bad, but he's not faking this. Jasmine looked at him. Henry nodded toward Graham. Been pushing me around all night, even helped me fill out the VA paperwork I've been putting off for 2 years. He shrugged. Didn't complain once. Graham looked surprised. He hadn't even thought it mattered. He just did it. Henry continued. I've had suits talk down to me, step over me, use me as a photo op. But this one, he listened. And that counts for something. Jasmine's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. Her arms were still folded, but something in her shoulders eased. Graham spoke again. I don't expect you to forgive me. Honestly, I wouldn't if I were you, but I wanted to be here. Not because Marcus told me to, not because my boss forced my hand, because after yesterday, I couldn't forget how I looked at you, and how wrong that was. His voice cracked just slightly, not from emotion, but from the weight of truth finally leaving his chest. I wanted to make you feel like you didn't belong, he admitted, because deep down, I was afraid you did. That landed, not just for Jasmine, but for Henry, and for 2 nearby guests who'd paused just long enough to listen. Jasmine stepped a little closer. Her heels made almost no sound on the polished floor. I've had people yell at me, threaten me, undermine me, she said. That comes with the job. She looked him dead in the eye. But what you did wasn't just about politics. It was personal. You used your position to make me feel small, and you did it with a smile. That's what cut the deepest. Graham nodded, ashamed. I know. But, she added, you're here. You showed up. You listened. And from what Henry's telling me, you didn't come to be seen. You came to serve. That doesn't erase what happened, but it matters. Graham swallowed hard. Thank you. Henry gave a small chuckle. Hell, I might even let him push me around next year if they do this again. Jasmine smiled then, a real one. It didn't come quickly. It didn't come easily. But it came. I won't lie, she said, looking at both of them. There was a moment yesterday where I thought, he'll never understand. He's too far gone. She looked back to Graham. I'm glad I was wrong. The trio stood there, surrounded by the soft clinking of glasses, the fading music, and the quiet murmurs of 100 conversations. Graham exhaled. His posture relaxed for the first time that night. He still felt out of place. But now, in a good way, because growth always feels a little uncomfortable. Jasmine placed a gentle hand on Henry's shoulder, then turned to Graham one last time. Next time someone like me walks into your showroom, she said, voice even but pointed, don't wait for a second chance to treat them right. I won't, he said. He meant it, and she knew it. As she turned and walked toward the far end of the ballroom, where Marcus waited by the exit in a sharp black tuxedo, Graham stayed beside Henry, silent, thoughtful. He watched as Jasmine crossed the floor. She wasn't walking like someone victorious. She walked like someone anchored, not by pride but by purpose. And in that moment, Graham Ellis finally understood what he'd never understood about her. She didn't carry power the way he was used to seeing it. Loud, visible, transactional. She carried it quietly. She carried it with people. As Jasmine walked away into the golden-lit end of the ballroom, Graham remained still, grounded beside Henry's wheelchair. The music was softer now, nearly faded. Guests were beginning to disperse, old friends hugging, veterans exchanging numbers. But Graham didn't move. Something about that conversation had rooted him in place. Not frozen, not ashamed, just humbled. He had come expecting a public reprimand. What he got instead was forgiveness, offered without demand. It left him with a strange ache, one that wasn't guilt, but recognition. And then he felt it, another presence. He turned. Marcus Crockett was approaching, calm and composed as always, but something new in his face tonight. Not the cold, businesslike stare Graham remembered. This was a man who had seen the whole picture and was deciding what to do with it. Dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, salt and pepper beard neat, Marcus walked with hands clasped behind his back. He stopped just short of Graham. In his right hand, he held a manila folder. No fanfare, no small talk, just the moment. Marcus offered the folder. Graham hesitated for half a second, then accepted it. Inside, purchase orders, specifications, fleet pricing, 6 fully equipped SUVs, Mercedes GLS models, designated for a national community safety program across 3 states. No press releases, no headlines, just logistics, supply chain, execution. You'll handle it, Marcus said, voice calm, measured. If you continue holding yourself the way you did tonight. Graham blinked. He opened the folder again as if to be sure. This is... He trailed off, unable to find the right word. Marcus nodded. Real. The silence between them held not tension, but truth. This isn't charity, Marcus continued. We have other vendors, bigger ones, faster ones. But this particular project involves community workers in South Dallas, Detroit, and parts of Baltimore, areas you once might have written off. If you treat those teams the way you treated my wife, Marcus added, tone tightening just enough, we'll pull the deal midstream. No hesitation. Graham nodded. Understood. Another beat. Marcus exhaled slowly, then extended his hand. Graham didn't reach for it immediately. He stared at it, remembering the last time they stood in a dealership, when that hand was a symbol of everything he had lost. But now it wasn't pity. It was a test and an invitation. Graham finally reached forward and shook it. Firm, honest, no script. His voice cracked, not from emotion, but sincerity too unfamiliar to feel smooth. Thank you, he said. Not for the contract, not for the numbers, but for the chance to make it right. Marcus held the handshake a second longer, then gave a single nod. Just make sure it stays right. He turned and began to walk away, fading back into the swirl of the gala like a general returning to his command. Graham looked down at the folder again, his fingers tightened around it, not out of possession, but responsibility. The room around him moved forward, but inside everything had stilled, not because he had been given redemption, because he had to earn it now. Henry, still seated beside him, glanced over. You gonna cry or get to work? The old vet asked, half joking. Graham laughed softly, the first real laugh he'd let out in days. I'm thinking, he said. Don't think too long, Henry muttered, turning his chair. That contract's got 6 vehicles, and you already wasted a whole day trying to keep one out of someone's hands. The truth in that stung. But it also settled in. Graham nodded, tucked the folder under one arm, and began pushing Henry toward the exit. This time with purpose. Not for show, not for optics, for the work. The ballroom had mostly emptied. Tables stood half cleared. Chairs were being stacked by quiet volunteers. But near the far windows where the city lights glittered just beyond the glass, Jasmine Crockett remained. She wasn't making a speech. She wasn't holding court. She stood with her husband Marcus, quietly watching as the last veterans made their way out of the gala they had helped build. And maybe that was the point. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply stays. And still, the air held weight, because what had happened inside that room wasn't just a fundraiser. It wasn't just Graham's reckoning or Henry's healing or a political reversal. It was something rarer, a clear human confrontation with a truth too many refused to say aloud. Not just in showrooms or offices or elections, but in restaurants, coffee shops, sidewalks, school board meetings. America isn't suffering from too much difference. It's suffering from too little respect. That's what Jasmine had always believed, even when people called her naive, even when machines told her to retaliate, to go harder, to weaponize media. But she never did, because the problem wasn't difference. It was what people do with it. They saw a different belief in assumed corruption. Graham Ellis wasn't unique. He was simply another man who thought political difference was permission for personal cruelty. And Jasmine had seen it before. She'd read about it in a Colorado courtroom, where a baker refused to make a cake for a same-sex wedding. Not because of the cost, but because of conviction. It escalated to the Supreme Court. People called it religious freedom. Others called it public service denial. But the truth was simpler. It was one human being deciding another's dignity could be debated. She'd seen it again, in a Starbucks in Philadelphia, where two black men were arrested for sitting without ordering, not loitering, not disruptive, just waiting. But suspicion didn't need reason. It just needed bias, wrapped in company policy. In Florida, a high school teacher who gave extra credit for attending political rallies, as long as they weren't left-leaning. In California, a pro-life student told to remove her t-shirt because it made people uncomfortable. Across the nation, political identity was becoming something more volatile than even race or religion. It was becoming a filter for basic humanity. Either you aligned or you didn't deserve service, didn't deserve fairness, didn't deserve presence. And Jasmine? She had lived both sides of that tension. She had walked into liberal spaces as a moderate Democrat and been told she was not progressive enough. She had walked into conservative spaces as a woman of color and been told implicitly, "You're lucky we let you in." But she never turned those moments into viral videos, never called reporters, never went on cable TV screaming, because what she and Marcus believed didn't need noise. It needed principle. That's why when Graham tried to humiliate her, they didn't sue, they didn't shame, they didn't clap back. They acted deliberately, quietly, sharply. They let character speak where the culture had learned only to shout. Marcus had always told her, the strongest stand is the one that doesn't flinch, and tonight had proven it again. When he stepped into that dealership, he didn't try to punish, he tried to correct. When he offered Graham the SUV contract, it wasn't a bribe, it was a burden. It said, now prove you're better than the version of yourself you were yesterday. Because real justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like responsibility. And Jasmine had learned that the hard way. Years ago, when she was still practicing law in Texas, she represented a veteran denied housing because of an old charge that had been dismissed. No felony, no conviction, just a line on a report. A landlord told her client, "We don't take chances." Jasmine fought for months to clear his name. Eventually, she won. Not because she yelled louder, but because she knew how to outlast the system without becoming bitter inside it. And that's what people still didn't understand. This wasn't about cars, or sales, or even politics. It was about what kind of country we want to be when no one is filming. Do we welcome people who disagree with us? Do we serve people we wouldn't vote for? Do we look strangers in the eye and say, "You matter, even if I don't understand you"? For Jasmine, the answer had to be yes. And tonight, something had shifted. Not everything, not forever, but enough. Because Graham Ellis had walked into that room still defensive, walked out humbled. Because Henry Morales, who had seen the worst of war, had found unexpected kindness in a man who once wouldn't serve as advocate. Because donors who had been skeptical were now asking for her next speaking date. And because Marcus, her anchor, had proven again, there's no louder message than integrity followed through. As the last of the guests left, Jasmine looked up. Marcus was walking back toward her from the coat check. He carried both their jackets. No entourage, no spotlight, just a tired man with pride behind his eyes. "Ready?" he asked softly. She nodded. They exited through the Hyatt's main doors, stepping into the cool night air of Washington, D.C. The street hummed with distant sirens and late-night taxis. City lights blinked across the river, and somewhere in the silence between them, Jasmine said quietly, "You did good tonight." Marcus smiled. "So did you." They stood there for a moment longer, coats draped over their arms, Watching the last valet bring up a bronze SUV for one of the donors, Jasmine exhaled slowly, then added, "Do you think it'll matter?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "It already does." She looked at him. He looked forward. Someone like Graham walks into a room like that, thinking he knows how the world works. And then he meets Henry, and you, and no one shames him. No one lectures him. They just make him see. He turned to her. "And if he changes because of that, then it matters." Jasmine nodded, finally putting on her coat. Because he was right. The story didn't need to go viral to be real. The moment didn't need to be televised to be true. It just had to happen. And hold. And tonight, it did. America might be torn in many ways, but as long as people like Jasmine and Marcus stood their ground, not loudly but clearly, there was hope. Not that the country would agree, but that it might finally remember how to disagree with decency. And maybe that was the beginning of something greater than any election could deliver. Maybe that was the beginning of repair. A week had passed since the gala, but the air around the Crockett home still felt charged with something more than memory. Jasmine could feel it as she moved through her quiet morning routine. There was no press release, no interview recap, no viral clip echoing in her notifications. And that was exactly how she wanted it, because what happened that night didn't need to be broadcast. It had done what it was meant to do. Not just to Graham Ellis, not just to the room full of donors and veterans, but to something larger, the invisible space between difference and dignity. That space had shifted. By late afternoon, the skies over Washington were heavy with pale clouds, casting a matte silver light over the city. Jasmine stood by the window of their two-story home, sipping black tea slowly from a ceramic mug, her eyes trailing the driveway below. Leaves were scattered across the slate pavers, crisp, gold, untouched. The house was still. Marcus was on a call in the back office, his voice low, steady. Then she heard it, not loud, not abrupt, but deep, smooth, like a whisper from a machine that knew its worth. A Mercedes-Benz 63 AMG coupe, obsidian black with chrome trim, rolled silently through the gates and into the driveway. It didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. Its presence alone said everything. Sleek, muscular, elegant, without showmanship, it glided forward as though it had been summoned not by money, but by meaning. A suited delivery agent stepped out with practiced grace. He didn't knock. He didn't ring the bell. He simply walked to the passenger side, opened the door, and held it open. Marcus appeared on the porch a moment later, slipping on a dark wool coat over his shirt. His steps were deliberate, unhurried, almost solemn, no grin of pride, no swagger, just a man, approaching a vehicle that had become more than metal and horsepower. He ran his hand along the roofline, fingers brushing the flawless finish, eyes narrowing just slightly. Jasmine opened the door behind him and joined him on the stone path. "They said delivery would be next week," she said, arms folded against the wind. Marcus didn't look away from the car. "Some things come faster when you move with the right kind of silence." She tilted her head. "So this is it?" He nodded. "Exactly as you wanted. Black, clean, no flash." The car gleamed under the gray sky, understated, yet imposing. Jasmine walked around to the front, rested her hand just above the emblem. "It's beautiful," she admitted, "but I don't know if it matters anymore." Marcus turned to her. "It matters because it didn't become the point." She looked at him, curious. He stepped beside her, voice quiet, but anchored with conviction. "You didn't let this car become a symbol of victory. You never wanted to prove you could buy it. You wanted to prove no one had the right to deny it.